Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric. Let's talk about Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, and today I've got another dungeon deck. Let's start off with a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today, and you can use the timestamps to navigate to any section of this video if you're in a hurry or something. First, we'll introduce today's commander, Hama Pashar, Ruinseeker, and we'll go over our general deck strategy. I'll discuss some of the most notable cards in the deck, go over the win conditions, and some cool combos or playlines. I won't mention every single card in the deck, but we will discuss a lot of them, and you can always see a link in the description for the full deck list. Then we'll go over the deck's stats and costs, so you can get a feel for how much interaction the deck has, how fast it can get going, and things like that. And of course, we'll see the deck's cost, and maybe some options to increase or decrease the value of the deck based on your budget. And then finally, I'll go over some alternative commanders you might want to use, or not use, or some considerations you might make when building around this commander or playing with this commander. Okay, so with that out of the way, Hama Pashar, Ruinseeker. This is our commander. It's a 2/3 human wizard that costs 1 white blue. It has room abilities of dungeons you own trigger an additional time. So we need to do a brief overview of dungeons before we get started. Dungeons are a new mechanic in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. You access them through cards in the set which say, venture into the dungeon. A dungeon map, for example, is a mana rock that can tap for colorless, or you can pay 3 and tap it to venture into the dungeon at sorcery speed. Now whenever you venture into a dungeon, if you're not already in a dungeon, you pick a dungeon. There's 3 of them. For example, Lost Mine of Phandelver. You advance to the first room of the dungeon, and you get the ability that triggers when you do. For Lost Mine of Phandelver, for example, you scry 1. The next time you venture into the dungeon, you'll move to the next room. In this case, that's either your choice of the Goblin Lair, in which case you'll make a 1/1 Goblin token, or the Mine Tunnels, and you'll make a treasure token. So each time you venture into the dungeon, you'll get one of these room triggers. And if you're already in a dungeon, you can only continue to go forward in that dungeon. You can't pick a new one. Once you complete a dungeon, then the next time you venture, you can pick any of the 3 existing dungeons in all of Magic to venture into, even the one you've just completed. Okay, so that's a brief overview of dungeons. With this deck, we're not using dungeons to generate value, we're using them as a win condition. So this is an Azorius Group Slug deck, and we'll use Hama Pashar to amplify our dungeon triggers as we venture into Tomb of Annihilation. Now this dungeon has 2 routes. In either route, the first room is Trapped Entry. Each player loses 1 life. Then you can go into either Veils of Fear. Each player loses 2 life unless they discard a card. And then if you ventured into this room, your next room is Sandfall Cell. Each player loses 2 life unless they sacrifice an artifact, a creature, or a land. Now if you didn't go into Veils of Fear, you can instead venture into Oubliette. You discard a card, sacrifice an artifact, a creature, and a land. Now this is kind of brutal for you, not your opponents. But it lets you finish the dungeon with only 3 ventures instead of 4 if we go that other route. And regardless of which route you take, the last room of the dungeon is Cradle of the Death God. You create the Atropal, a legendary 4/4 black god horror creature token with Death Touch. And in this deck we're going to repeatedly venture into the Tomb of Annihilation so that we can drain our opponents out of life, or otherwise tax them into submission by forcing them to discard cards or sacrifice permanents. We'll go through the Trapped Entry, Veils of Fear, and Sandfall Cell before finishing the dungeon at the Cradle of the Death God. And because Hama Pashar doubles all of our room abilities, she effectively doubles the tax or life loss that all players will pay. For example, when we trigger the Veils of Fear room, each player will need to discard a card or pay 2 life twice. Now unfortunately with the last room of the dungeon, the Cradle of the Death God, we won't gain any benefit from Hama Pashar, since the creature token that we generate is legendary, so creating 2 of them won't help us. But that's okay, since we really only care about the first 3 rooms in this deck. So again, our game plan is effectively an Azorius Group Slug deck, which I really like because Group Slug doesn't typically work in white and blue. But while Hama Pashar makes our dungeon venturing more effective, she doesn't actually let us venture into the dungeon herself. So let's talk about the specific cards in this deck, starting with the Dungeon Venture Enablers. Okay, if we can't venture into the dungeon, then Hama Pashar is useless, and she can't venture on her own. There are 21 total cards in all of Magic that let us venture into the dungeon in Azorius colors, but some of them are quite bad. We'll run most of the useful ones in this deck. Cloister Gargoyle, Displacer Beast, Eccentric Apprentice, Nadar, Selfless Paladin, Veteran Dungeoneer. All of these are creatures that have you venture into the dungeon when they enter the battlefield. So using a blink effect on any of these creatures, for example, can give you repeated dungeon venture triggers. Cloister Gargoyle is a 0/4, but it gets +3/+0 and flying as long as you've completed a dungeon. Displacer Beast can also bounce itself back to your hand for 3 and a blue. With its casting cost of 2 and a blue, that gives a total cost of 7 mana, 5 and 2 blue, to venture into the dungeon repeatedly, all on its own without a blink effect. 7 mana is a lot, but we're not going to rely on bouncing Displacer Beast and recasting it unless we really need to. Eccentric Apprentice also has a triggered ability. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've completed a dungeon, up to one target creature becomes a bird with base power and toughness 1/1 and flying until end of turn, for some reason. So this can help make an opponent's blocker really tiny, or to give one of your own creatures flying to help get in for combat damage, but it'll be a 1/1, so that's not worth it most of the time. Nadar Selfless Paladin also ventures when it attacks, and it gives all of your other creatures +1/+1 as long as you've completed a dungeon. But we'll also use Secret Door. It's a 1 mana 0/4 with a defender that lets you pay 4 and a blue, which is a lot, to venture into a dungeon. Again, use it if you need to, but it isn't going to be your first priority. There's Delver's Torch, an equipment, gives the equipped creature +1/+1. When the equipped creature attacks, you venture into the dungeon. Yuan T. Malison, or something like that, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. This is an easy dungeon enabler. It gives you 1 venture per turn, as long as it's the only attacker, because if it's the only attacker, it can't be blocked. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you venture into the dungeon. We've got Midnight Pathlighter. This is a 4 mana 2/3 human wizard that says creatures you control can't be blocked except by legendary creatures, and whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. So Midnight Pathlighter helps you get in for combat damage and rewards you with venture triggers when you hit a player. And note this triggers for each player you hit in combat, not each creature you deal damage to a player with. So in a typical 4-player game, if you deal combat damage to each of your opponents, Midnight Pathlighter will give you up to 3 dungeon venture triggers per turn, which is not bad. But our strongest dungeon venture enabler, especially if we're playing a blink deck, spoiler, we are playing a blink deck, it's Radiant Solar. This is a 3/6 angel with flying and lifelink. It costs 5 white, and it has whenever Radiant Solar or another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, venture into the dungeon. You can also pay white and discard Radiant Solar from your hand to gain 3 life and venture into the dungeon. So again, venture into the dungeon whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control. If we are blinking creatures all the time, and again we will be, then Radiant Solar lets us venture into the dungeon each time we blink a creature, on top of any venture trigger that creature might already generate. And if we manage to blink all of our creatures at once, and we can do that in this deck, then Radiant Solar will generate a bunch of venture triggers for us all at once, at least one for each creature that we blink. This is definitely our strongest dungeon venture enabler. But speaking of blink, let's go over those cards that help us generate repeated enters the battlefield value. Blinking our creatures onto and off of the battlefield is integral to this deck's functionality. Fortunately, blue and white are the best colors for this strategy. We've got several repeatable blink enablers that'll provide us with lots of long-term value. Teleportation Circle, Thassa Deep Dwelling, Conjurer's Closet, all of these have triggered abilities that at the beginning of your end step, you exile a creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under your control. Teleportation Circle also does the same for artifacts if you want, though that isn't very relevant in this deck. Thassa Deep Dwelling is also an indestructible enchantment, and a creature if your devotion to blue is 5 or greater, and it also lets you pay 3 into blue to tap another target creature. There's Blade of Selves. This is a pseudo-blink effect. It's an equipment that costs 2 and equips for 4. The equipped creature has Myriad, so whenever it attacks you make a token copy of it for each opponent that it isn't attacking, and you create a token copy of the equipped creature that's tapped and attacking that opponent. You exile those tokens at the end of combat. Now I wanted to mention Blade of Selves because it's not really a blink effect, but it accomplishes the same goal. That is, generating repeated enter the battlefield effects for our creatures. Now at the last moment of bringing this deck down to 100 cards to finalize the deck list, I cut Blade of Selves from the list, primarily for budget reasons, as it's still $20. But it is a great card, you could consider it if you like this one. There's Deadeye Navigator. This is infamous in blink decks, though it is fairly mana intensive to get it started. It's a 6 mana 5/5 that can soul bond with any creature you control when either Deadeye Navigator or that creature enters the battlefield. Then you can pay 1 and a blue to blink either Deadeye Navigator or the creature it's soul bonded with. Honestly, Deadeye Navigator is pretty oppressive if you abuse it, but you will need a lot of mana to get it started, since it costs 6 to cast and 2 mana to activate each time you activate it. We have several mass blink cards that we can use to blink our entire team all at once. Eerie Interlude is a 3 mana instant that lets you blink any number of your creatures, and they return to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step, so you can evade board wipes, for example. Semester's End does the same thing for 4 mana, also at instant speed, and it also returns those creatures to the battlefield with an extra +1/+1 counter. Yorion Sky Nomad is a mass blink effect on a creature. It's a 5 mana 4/5 with flying that has, when Yorion enters the battlefield, exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control, return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Notice this is an enter the battlefield effect, so if you combine Yorion with any repeatable single target blink effect like Conjurer's Closet, you can blink all of your creatures almost every turn. These are normal blink deck shenanigans, but still it can get pretty insane, so I wanted to mention it. And remember, you can use any of these mass blink effects with Radiant Solar to generate a bunch of dungeon venture triggers all at once, since you'll venture into the dungeon effectively for every creature that blinks. Finally, we'll use some single-use blink effects that can protect our board or generate surprise enter the battlefield effects to catch our opponents off guard. Cards like Cloud Shift, Ephemerate, Momentary Blink, these are all 1 and 2 mana instants that let you blink a creature, generate another enter the battlefield effect, and again, you can use them to let one of your creatures dodge targeted removal too. Oh, and don't forget, we can use Panharmonicon to double up any of our enter the battlefield effects. This one's really powerful, but it's obvious too. When you combine Panharmonicon with Hama Pashar, then each time you venture into the dungeon, you go through 2 rooms, and you get each of those rooms triggers twice. This is disgusting. So again, we've got lots of blink effects in this deck because they enable everything else we're doing. Not just venturing into the dungeon, but card draw, removal, stuff like that. We're running 14 or 15 blink effects in this deck, and I didn't mention all of them, but again, you can check out the link to the deck list in the description for more details. Okay, so now we can venture through the dungeon repeatedly by blinking our venture creatures, but our dungeon, Tomb of Annihilation, affects all players, including us, so we will be losing life as fast as our opponents. Let's talk about how we'll survive the Tomb of Annihilation longer than our opponents. So in this deck we're going to use life gain to offset the life that we lose to Tomb of Annihilation. With our access to white, we can play some very effective life gain cards. Soul Warden and Soul's Attendant gain us 1 life whenever any creature enters the battlefield. This of course includes any creature that we blink, and of course any creature that enters the battlefield under our opponent's control. For only 1 mana to cast, these are definitely worth the investment. Ajani's Welcome is similar, but it only triggers when a creature enters the battlefield under your control. But it's also an enchantment rather than a creature, so it'll be harder for your opponents to remove. Dawnbringer Cleric is a new 2 mana 1/3 with an enter the battlefield trigger that lets you either gain 2 life, destroy a target enchantment, or exile a target card from a graveyard. And with all of our blink effects, this is either repeatable life gain or removal. We have life gain on our card draw effects too. A Priest of Ancient Lore is a 3 mana 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and you draw 1 card. For 4 mana, Elite Guard Mage is a 2/3 flyer that gains you 3 life and draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. Cloud Blazer costs 5 and it's a 2/2 flyer that gains you 2 life and draws you 2 cards when it enters. We'll also use Heliod's Intervention, which you can use at instant speed to either destroy some artifacts and or enchantments, or gain some life. We'll play Blind Obedience. This is an enchantment that slows our opponents down by making their creatures enter the battlefield tapped, But it also has Extort, so whenever you cast a spell, you can pay Orzhov, that's either 1 white or 1 black, and if you do, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain that much life. So in a typical 4-player game, you'll gain 3 life every time you extort a spell. And then we'll use Sphinx's Revelation and Azor the Lawbringer. Sphinx's Revelation is an instant that costs white, blue, blue, and X. You draw X cards and gain X life. And Azor the Lawbringer is a 6/6 flyer that costs 2 white, white, blue, blue. When it enters the battlefield, your opponents can't cast instant or sorcery spells during that player's next turn. So first, if we can blink Azor every turn, then we can turn off our opponents from ever playing sorceries again. But Azor can also repeatedly cast Sphinx's Revelation for us too, because when it attacks, you can pay white, blue, blue, and X, and if you do, you draw X cards and gain X life. Azor costs a bunch of mana, but we can take advantage of both its attack trigger and its enter the battlefield trigger in this deck, so I think it's worth it here. So that's our life gain. Again, there aren't a ton of cards here, but most of them can give us repeated value to keep our life total high as we venture through the Tomb of Annihilation. And that's actually most of the deck, but there are a few other synergistic pieces that I want to talk about as well. As long as we're playing a blink deck, there's lots of cards that we can use to generate value. There's classic removal like Amphin Mutineer and Skyclave Apparition that really like to enter the battlefield as many times as possible and start exiling our opponent's things. Knight of the White Orchid, Boreas Charger, or Escos Explorer, these help us ramp or at least fix our mana. I picked these 3 because they search for a plains, not a basic plains, and we're running the white and blue dual lands that happen to be plains. Irrigated Farmland, Glacial Floodplain, and Prairie Stream all can be found with these creatures enter the battlefield triggers. And of course, blinking these creatures will continually ramp us throughout the game too. Now I'm running Sun Titan and Angel of Serenity for some recursion. A Sun Titan is a 6 mana 6/6 that lets you put a permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard onto the battlefield whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks. Angel of Serenity is really cool. I've been liking it more and more as I've been trying it out in different decks. It's 7 mana, so that's a lot. It's a 5/6 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you get to exile up to 3 other target creatures from the battlefield and or creature cards from graveyards. And when it leaves the battlefield, you return those exiled cards to their owner's hands. So this is really versatile. First, Angel of Serenity can be used as temporary removal since we can target our opponent's creatures, and up to 3 of them. But unlike a lot of other creatures with this ETB removal effect, think Banisher Priest, when something like Banisher Priest exiles a creature, that creature is returned to the battlefield when Banisher Priest leaves the battlefield. With Angel of Serenity, that creature is returned to its owner's hand. So if you cast Angel of Serenity and immediately blink it so that it leaves the battlefield, it can essentially read as, when Angel of Serenity enters the battlefield, return up to 3 target creatures to their owner's hands. This is really, really strong. And it gets better too. We can exile creatures from graveyards, which then go back to their owner's hand when Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield. So again, if you can blink Angel of Serenity, it can basically be, when Angel of Serenity enters the battlefield, return up to 3 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, which is again very awesome. Now, because we're focused on life gain and dungeon venturing and blinking, I didn't have much room for other blink recursion classics in this deck, like Revelark, Karmic Guide, and I wanted to keep Sun Titan because it can help us recur non-creature permanents, and Angel of Serenity is just a powerhouse that combines recursion and removal. So I didn't find space for Revelark and Karmic Guide, but they are good cards, and if you can make space for them, you can certainly consider them, but that's just why I'm not using them in this deck. Now the last card I want to mention is Cryptolith Fragment. This is a 3 mana rock that taps for mana of any color, and when you tap it, each player will lose 1 life. This is a mediocre mana rock, but it just helps to drain everyone out while fixing our mana. Cryptolith Fragment also transforms at the beginning of your upkeep if all players have 10 life or less, and it transforms into Aurora of Emrakul. This is a 1/4 creature with flying and death touch, and whenever it attacks, each opponent loses 3 life. I don't expect Cryptolith Fragment to transform often, but when it does, it can help drain your opponents out. And that is the deck. Let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This deck has an average mana value of 3.02. We are using 36 lands, and we have 12 cards that let us venture into the dungeon. Now this isn't a lot, but we don't want to use bad cards, so I've selected only the best venture cards. And our Blink engine allows us to dirtle around and gain value until we can draw into those venture cards, so we're not in trouble as we're waiting on those. We have 14 cards in this deck that enable or amplify our enters the battlefield effects, our Blink engine. There are 10 cards that gain us life, again to help us survive venturing into the Tomb of Annihilation, so that it hopefully kills our opponents faster than it kills us. We're also using 10 card draw cards and 9 pieces of ramp. And finally we have 10 pieces of single target removal and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $128 on tcgplayer.com. So this is a reasonably budget deck. If you wanted to reduce the cost even further, there are a few cards in the deck that are around $10 or more that you might consider removing. Deadeye Navigator and Thassa Deep Dwelling are great, repeatable Blink enablers, but Deadeye Navigator is $12 and Thassa is $13. You might consider Eldrazi Displacer. This is a 3-mana 3/3 that lets you pay 2 and a colorless to exile another target creature, then return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Just beware of the colorless mana in this activated ability cost. It literally has to be paid with colorless mana specifically. The colored mana will not work. And if you want to run Eldrazi Displacer, you might also consider more mana rocks or lands that tap for colorless mana. There are currently 6 total sources of colorless mana in the deck, and I don't think that's enough to support Eldrazi Displacer. Skyclave Apparition is awesome removal. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile up to 1 non-token, non-land permanent you don't control with mana value 4 or less, and when it leaves the battlefield, that permanent stays exiled, which is awesome. Instead, its owner just gets an XX illusion creature token, where X is the mana value of the exiled card. So again, Skyclave Apparition is awesome removal in a Blink deck, but it's also $8. You could swap it for Meteor Golem, which destroys a non-land permanent when it enters the battlefield. This is very versatile and easy on the budget, but Meteor Golem also costs 7 mana. There's the Panharmonicon, that 4-mana artifact that doubles all of your ETB effects. There's really no replacement for this, and so this card is $8. Now, I think $8 for Panharmonicon is a pretty good deal. It's easily worth this for what it can do. But if you really want to squeeze the budget a bit, you might swap it for Strionic Resonator, which lets you pay 2 and tap it to copy a triggered ability you control. Still, this costs $3.50, so it doesn't save you too much over Panharmonicon, and it's much worse since it only copies a single triggered ability and it costs mana to activate. Alright, so that is what I like to call Hama Pashar, Seeker of Annihilation. So I like draining out our opponents in this deck with Tomb of Annihilation as we venture into the dungeon. But if you're behind and you need to catch up and maybe you can't afford to pay all that life to go through Tomb of Annihilation, the cool thing about dungeons is that you can pick any of them to go through. I've definitely gone through the Dungeon of the Mad Mage with this deck when I needed more resources, and then, started going into the Tomb of Annihilation later when I'd recovered a bit. Overall, this deck is another obnoxious Azorius Blink deck, like Yorion or Brago or stuff like that. But unlike those decks, we actually have a built-in win condition through Tomb of Annihilation. And again, playing Azorius Group Slug is kind of fun. And don't underestimate the value that we'll get from Hama Pashar to accelerate the rate at which we get our dungeon room abilities, or effectively doubling them up. In deck building this one, I tried other venture commanders, like ones that can actually venture all on their own, like Nadar Selfless Paladin, like Barrowin of Clan Undur, and I found that doubling the room abilities with Hama Pashar is really necessary if we want to tax our opponents hard enough with Tomb of Annihilation to be effective. So even though Hama Pashar can't venture herself, she is really valuable as the leader of this deck. However, because we need venture cards in this deck, we can't go quite as deep into Blink shenanigans as other dedicated Blink decks might. So a lot of the Blink synergy cards like Peregrine Drake, Agent of Treachery, Venser, Shaper Savant, there just isn't space for them here, even though these cards are very awesome in a Blink deck. But even though we need those venture cards for our win condition, we can still play the game without them. If we don't have a venture card on the board, we can still set up our blink engine, draw a bunch of cards, gain a bunch of life, so we're ready to take advantage of a venture card once we draw into it. So we'll rely on those venture cards to win the game most of the time, but we can still hit our basic functions like card draw, removal, even getting in some combat damage without them. But that is all I've got for today. I've got at least one more commander deck built for an Adventures in the Forgotten Realms commander. That is Krydle of the Baldur's Gate. At this point, I'm undecided on whether or not I'll make a deck tech video for this one. Krydle is just not that great, and I'm not sure the deck I've built really utilizes Krydle to its fullest. That said, if anyone's interested in hearing about it, let me know in the comments. I'll certainly consider making a video for Krydle if there's interest, or at least sharing a link to the deck list. Also, let me know if there's any other deck techs you'd like to see featuring Adventures in the Forgotten Realms commanders or mechanics. I can't make any promises that I can build around all requests. Unfortunately, I did receive a request to build around Shesra Death's Whisper, but I just wasn't able to come up with anything that really utilized this commander to any significant extent. I think Shesra is just too weak to be of much value as a commander, but I really do appreciate the request, and I'm sorry that I won't be able to meet this one. I'd really like to build around the Tarask, but I think this one's also probably too weak to really take advantage of. Anyways, I've run out of meaningful things to say, so that is enough rambling. Thank you for watching.